Welcome everyone to Easy History Podcast.
Hi.
Today we're diving deep into a really pivotal period, the Peninsular War,
Yeah.
from 1809 to 1811.
Hmm.
And we're going to unpack the critical events.
Okay.
We're going to dissect the strategies employed.
Right.
And we're going to try to understand precisely why this particular struggle in Spain and Portugal became such a persistent and ultimately debilitating challenge for Napoleon.
Yeah.
And get ready to explore the fluctuating fortunes of battles,
Okay.
the remarkable tenacity of the local populations,
Sure.
and the emergence of some key figures who left a real mark on this compelling chapter in history.
Yeah, this is a fascinating period to look at, particularly when you consider just the seemingly unstoppable force that Napoleon commanded across Europe at this time.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that this war on the Iberian Peninsula became such a long-standing and irritating problem for him really speaks to the limits of even the most powerful military when faced with determined resistance on multiple fronts.
Okay, so let's begin then by looking at 1809.
Sure.
And I think the picture that emerges is of Napoleon at the very zenith of his power.
Exactly.
Fresh from a decisive victory against Austria at Wagram. He's essentially redrawing the map of the continent at this point.
Exactly. The triumph at Wagram and the subsequent peace treaty really solidified his dominance over a significant portion of Europe.
Yeah.
However, the situation in Spain and Portugal, as we'll explore, was like a wound that just wouldn't heal.
Yeah.
The invasion of the previous year hadn't delivered that swift and decisive outcome that Napoleon had clearly anticipated.
That's right. He had placed his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne, believing this would bring stability. But the proud Spanish people were having none of it. There was widespread opposition. It wasn't just the regular armies, it was the people themselves who rose up.
What's particularly striking is the immediate and intense reaction of the Spanish people. They viewed Joseph as an illegitimate ruler imposed on them by a foreign power, and this ignited a really strong sense of national pride and a spirit of resistance that Napoleon clearly underestimated. This widespread popular opposition, as you can see, immediately presented a different kind of challenge than Napoleon had typically faced in other European campaigns.
And the French response was, by all accounts, brutal. They came down hard on these popular uprisings, and initially they achieved considerable success against the conventional Spanish armies.
Yes, Napoleon's military machine was still incredibly potent. The Spanish armies at this point often lacked proper equipment and effective leadership, making them vulnerable to the seasoned French forces. However, these battlefield victories didn't translate into the complete pacification of the territory. I mean, winning battles is one thing. Controlling a hostile population across a large and diverse landscape is quite another, as you might imagine.
We see a really grim illustration of this with the siege of Saragossa. I mean, the sheer scale of human loss is staggering. 54,000 Spanish lives lost, along with 10,000 French casualties. I mean, that's a brutal example of the cost of this conflict. And this was in February 1809. Yet even after this French victory, the Spanish and Portuguese people continued their resistance. This incredible civilian resistance, it really demonstrates for you how nationalism, even without a strong central army, could cripple an occupying force. A lesson Napoleon seemed slow to grasp.
The siege of Saragossa really stands as a testament to the fierce determination of the Spanish to resist. It wasn't just the soldiers defending the city, it was the ordinary civilians who took up arms. This kind of widespread popular resistance, even when facing overwhelming odds and horrific casualties, signaled a fundamental problem for the occupying French forces. You can win individual battles, but how do you effectively subdue an entire population that is so vehemently opposed to your presence?
It really sets the stage for the next phase of the conflict, doesn't it? Because just 3 months after the British retreat from Corunna, they return. Sir Arthur Wellesley arrives in Lisbon in April 1809 to take command of a small Anglo-Portuguese army.
The return of the British is a crucial turning point. While their initial involvement had ended in a difficult retreat, their commitment to the Peninsular Campaign remained firm. Wellesley's arrival really marked the beginning of a sustained and ultimately successful effort to remove the French from the Iberian Peninsula.
And there's a real emphasis on the importance of British training for the Portuguese troops.
Absolutely.
Apparently, with this support, they would soon prove highly effective.
Yeah.
This Anglo-Portuguese alliance would become a cornerstone of the resistance.
The British brought not only their own well-trained forces,
right,
but also the crucial organizational skills and military expertise needed to transform the Portuguese army into a credible fighting force.
Yeah.
This combined Anglo-Portuguese army would become a significant obstacle to French ambitions in the region.
Wellesley didn't waste any time. Just 3 weeks after arriving, he moved against Marshal Soult's Second Corps.
Okay.
Now, a corps, just for your understanding, is a large military formation, typically comprising several divisions.
Okay.
Soult's corps had recently taken Porto.
Right.
And it seems Soult was completely unprepared for Wellesley's arrival.
Yeah.
His troops were preoccupied with looting, leading to a rather hasty retreat back into Spain.
Soult's overconfidence and the lack of discipline within his troops certainly played a significant role in this early success for Wellesley. His swift action caught the French completely off guard, demonstrating the potential of this newly formed Anglo-Portuguese force.
Yeah.
It also highlights for you the dangers of an occupying force becoming complacent and neglecting basic military discipline.
Having secured Portugal.
Wellesley then planned a joint campaign with the Spanish General Cuesta and the Army of Extremadura.
Okay.
They met on July 10th to discuss strategy.
Right.
But it's important to understand that the relationship between the British and Spanish allies was anything but straightforward.
This is a critical aspect to grasp.
Right.
Centuries of conflict between Britain and Spain had created deep-seated suspicion on both sides. The Spanish were wary of Britain's long-term intentions in the Iberian Peninsula, while the British held a rather low opinion of the Spanish army's capabilities. They were training their leadership pretty much across the board.
Wellesley's request to take overall command of the Spanish forces was rejected, which, considering later events, does seem like a significant missed opportunity for the Allied effort.
Yeah.
However, they did agree on a joint advance along the Tagus Valley towards Madrid.
Okay.
With support from General Venegas advancing from La Mancha.
Despite this underlying distrust, the shared necessity of confronting the French
led to this somewhat uneasy alliance.
Yeah.
The plan was ambitious, aiming to directly threaten Madrid and force a decisive French response.
In response to this advance, Marshal Victor's I Corps retreated to Talavera, where they were reinforced by King Joseph himself and General Sebastiani's Fourth Corps. The French plan, as it developed, was for Joseph's army to defend Madrid, while Marshal Soult led 3 corps from the north to encircle the Anglo-Spanish forces.
It was a classic Napoleonic strategy of maneuver and envelopment, aiming to trap and destroy the enemy. Soult's move from the north was intended to cut off the Allied lines of communication and force a decisive battle on ground favorable to the French.
But Joseph grew concerned, didn't he?
Yeah.
He was worried about Soult's rather slow progress and the fact that Venegas was advancing on Madrid. This led him to decide to offer battle at Talavera rather than wait for Soult's potentially delayed encirclement.
Joseph felt compelled to act directly, rather than waiting for a potentially drawn-out strategic maneuver. This decision to engage the Allies at Talavera was a direct consequence of his concerns about the immediate threats to Madrid.
The Battle of Talavera itself saw the British infantry play a crucial role. They faced the main French assault, and through incredibly disciplined musket fire and resolute bayonet charges, managed to hold their ground.
Talavera, while smaller in scale compared to some of the major battles fought in Central Europe that year, was a vital demonstration of the British Army's resilience and fighting ability under Wellesley's command. It proved to both the French and the Allies that the British were a force capable of standing toe-to-toe with Napoleon's best troops.
But rather frustratingly, the victory at Talavera yielded limited strategic gains in the short term. Why was that the case?
The primary reason for this was the approaching forces of Marshal Soult in the north. Captured French dispatches revealed the significant threat they posed to the Allied rear, forcing the victorious Anglo-Spanish army to retreat rather rapidly to avoid being cut off and potentially destroyed. So while they won the battle, the strategic situation remained quite precarious.
And while the Allies were retreating, King Joseph and the Five Corps turned their attention to General Venegas and rather decisively destroyed his army at the Battle of Almanacid.
Precisely.
So a real mix of results in this period.
While the Allies had achieved a tactical victory at Talavera, the French quickly responded by neutralizing one of the supporting Spanish forces. This underscored the continued weaknesses within the Spanish military structure and the challenges of maintaining a cohesive Allied strategy.
Following these events, the Spanish Junta Suprema, the governing body, made efforts in the autumn to raise two new armies with the aim of liberating Madrid, planning a two-pronged attack. But Wellington, by this time, Viscount Wellington, after his victory at Talavera, had become deeply disillusioned with the evident lack of Spanish cooperation. And crucially refused to risk his army in what he perceived as their rather optimistic plans. Wellington's refusal, as you can see, wasn't just stubbornness. It was based on a clear-eyed assessment of the strategic risk involved with relying on forces prone to such devastating defeats.
Wellington's frustration was certainly understandable. He had experienced firsthand the difficulties of coordinating with the Spanish command and had serious doubts about the capabilities of their newly raised armies. He was unwilling to jeopardize his own forces in what he considered poorly conceived and high-risk operations.
And unfortunately, his caution proved to be very well-founded. The new inexperienced Spanish armies suffered predictable disasters. At Ocaña, they endured their largest defeat of the entire war, completely routed by a smaller French force under Marshal Soult, losing a staggering 14,000 prisoners and 50 cannons. And then just a week later, their left-wing army suffered another heavy defeat at Alba de Tormes. These defeats were devastating blows to the Spanish war effort. They decimated their already weakened forces and further exposed the inadequacies of their military leadership.
These successive defeats were indeed catastrophic to the Spanish regular army. They not only resulted in enormous losses of men and equipment, but also severely damaged morale and further undermined confidence in the Junta Suprema's ability to prosecute the war effectively.
Adding to the bleak situation for the anti-French forces, Girona finally fell to the French after an incredibly grueling 7-month siege. This shattered the Junta Suprema's already fragile plans to retake Madrid and left southern Spain considerably more vulnerable to French advances. So as 1809 drew to a close, despite the brief glimmer of hope at Talavera, the overall picture for those opposing the French was decidedly grim.
Exactly. Despite the continued pockets of resistance, the French had largely reasserted their military dominance in Spain by the end of 1809. The Spanish regular forces had suffered a series of damaging defeats, and the prospect of driving the French out of Madrid seemed distant indeed.
Then we move into 1810, and King Joseph initiated a southward march in January with a substantial army of 60,000 men. Organized Spanish resistance appeared to collapse in the face of this significant advance.
Joseph's southward advance was a powerful demonstration of French military strength. The rapid fall of key cities like Córdoba and Seville, without significant resistance, really underscores the demoralization and disarray within the Spanish military and political structures at this point. The Junta Suprema itself was overthrown in a coup. Highlighting the severe internal instability within Spain.
It's interesting to note that there was a degree of hope from Joseph, that he could win over the Spanish population with his proposed progressive reforms. And he was initially welcomed by some as a potential liberator from the prevailing anarchy. It paints a more complex picture than simple universal rejection of French rule.
Indeed, there were certainly elements within Spanish society who were open to the reforms that Joseph offered and who viewed the previous regime as ineffective and even corrupt. However, this level of support was ultimately limited and couldn't overcome the deep-seated nationalistic sentiment against what was still perceived as foreign imposition.
The one significant area that continued to resist was Cadiz, which was strategically bolstered by the presence of a British naval squadron. The city was subsequently placed under siege by Victor's Eight Corps. This siege would become a rather protracted and important affair, wouldn't it?
Cadiz being a major port city and heavily defended by the Royal Navy. proved incredibly difficult for the French to capture.
Yeah.
It became a crucial symbol of continued Spanish resistance.
Right.
And a vital base of operations for the Allied forces throughout the remainder of the war.
Right.
The siege itself would tie down a significant number of French troops for an extended period.
Yeah.
Resources they could ill afford to lose elsewhere.
Meanwhile, Napoleon decided to reinforce his forces in the peninsula significantly, dispatching Marshal Massena with a massive 65,000 reinforcements.
Right.
Massena had a formidable reputation as one of Napoleon's most capable marshals.
Yeah.
Having recently been honored with the title Prince of Essling, his mission was clear. A third major French invasion of Portugal, the capture of Lisbon, and the expulsion of the British forces.
Massena was indeed a highly respected and experienced commander.
Right.
And his arrival with such a substantial force signaled a renewed and serious French effort to finally resolve the Peninsular War.
Yeah.
Napoleon clearly believed that Massena possessed the ability to achieve what previous commanders had not.
Massena began his campaign by besieging and ultimately capturing Ciudad Rodrigo, a key fortified city that controlled a major route into Portugal. It fell relatively quickly after about 2 weeks of bombardment.
The fall of Ciudad Rodrigo was a significant setback for the Allied cause.
Right.
It effectively opened a major gateway into Portugal for Massena's large army and placed Lisbon under a much more direct and immediate threat.
Facing Massena's 50,000 troops, with a considerably smaller force of only 33,000, Wellington made a strategic decision to retreat. Massena then crossed into Portugal and laid siege to Almeida. And then quite dramatically, there was a devastating accidental explosion of Almeida's gunpowder magazine. After just 13 hours of bombardment, which effectively rendered any further resistance futile. That must have been a significant blow.
It was indeed a major stroke of bad luck for the Allies and a significant boost for Massena's advance. Wellington had certainly been counting on Almeida's defenses to hold out for a more considerable period, buying him crucial time to consolidate his own defensive positions further south, closer to Lisbon. The rapid and unexpected loss of such a key fortress was a considerable disappointment and forced a change in his immediate plans.
However, Wellington did manage to find a strong defensive position at Busaco. And there, he successfully repelled Massena's direct uphill frontal assault, inflicting around 4,000 casualties on the French. It sounds like a notable victory.
The Battle of Busaco was certainly an important morale booster for the Anglo-Portuguese forces, proving that they could indeed stand their ground and inflict losses on Massena's larger army when fighting from a strong defensive position. However, it's important to remember that it was primarily a tactical victory. It didn't fundamentally alter the overall strategic situation.
Because as we understand it, the very next day, Massena skillfully outmaneuvered Wellington, forcing the British retreat to continue.
Exactly.
So despite the losses at Busaco, Massena was still very much advancing towards Lisbon.
Massena recognized that launching repeated direct assaults on Wellington's prepared positions would be too costly in terms of manpower. He therefore sought and successfully found a way to maneuver around Wellington's flank, compelling the Anglo-Portuguese army to continue its withdrawal towards the heavily defended area around Lisbon.
This brings us to the rather unexpected discovery by Massena's scouts of the extensive and formidable lines of Torres Vedras, a complex network of fortifications specifically designed to protect Lisbon. These defenses, we learn, had been under construction by the British and Portuguese.
For over a year. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. Wellington's foresight in constructing these defenses over a year prior showcases the importance of strategic planning, encountering a superior enemy.
The lines at Torres Vedras were a truly remarkable feat of military engineering. And their existence was a closely guarded secret. They represented Wellington's strategic foresight and his deep understanding of how to effectively defend against numerically superior attacking force. The scale of these defenses was immense.
Indeed, the scale was quite staggering. Over 100 individual forts, redoubts, and batteries, manned by a substantial force of 30,000 soldiers and equipped with around 250 cannons. It must have come as a considerable shock to Massena's army.
It was a complete and unwelcome surprise for Massena.
Right.
He had undoubtedly anticipated being able to advance on Lisbon with relatively little major opposition.
Instead, he found himself confronted by a highly formidable defensive barrier that was simply too strong to attack directly without incurring unacceptable losses.
Adding to Massena's significant problems was the implementation of a devastating scorched earth policy by the Allies. This scorched earth policy, as you might infer, meant deliberately destroying any resources, food shelter supplies, that the advancing French army could potentially use. Furthermore, Portuguese partisans were actively harassing the already strained French supply lines. Think of it like trying to put out two fires at once with a limited amount of water, as you can imagine. Any resources you dedicate to, one leaves the other burning.
This combination of factors created a truly dire situation for the French army. They were unable to effectively attack the lines of Torres Vedras. And they were simultaneously unable to forage for sufficient supplies in the systematically devastated countryside. Their already long supply lines back into Spain were also under constant threat from the activities of the Portuguese guerrillas operating in the mountains.
So Massena found himself in a truly precarious position. His army was rapidly running out of essential supplies. They were far too weak to launch a credible assault on the Allied lines. And yet he was understandably reluctant to order a retreat. This period also saw severe suffering for the Portuguese peasantry due to the widespread destruction of their villages and farms, leading to famine and disease within Lisbon itself. It's a grim reminder of the immense human cost of this protracted conflict.
The suffering endured by the civilian population during this stalemate was indeed immense. The scorched earth policy, while strategically necessary from the Allied perspective, to deny resources to the French, had a truly devastating impact on the Portuguese people, many of whom were forced to flee their homes and seek refuge in Lisbon, with little in the way of food shelter or basic necessities.
While this critical stalemate was unfolding in Portugal, we should remember that Napoleon himself was preoccupied with significant events back in France, including his divorce from Josephine, his subsequent marriage to Archduchess Marie-Louise of Austria, and the anticipation of the birth of his first child. It seems his focus was perhaps understandably somewhat divided during this period.
Exactly. While the Peninsular War continued to rage, Napoleon's attention and energies were also significantly consumed by these important dynastic matters and his broader strategic ambitions across Europe. This geographical and, to some extent, mental distance likely contributed to a degree of underestimation of the very real and growing challenges that his marshals were facing on the Iberian Peninsula.
We learn that Napoleon's frequent orders to his marshals in Spain and Portugal were often somewhat outdated and demonstrated a lack of a clear understanding of the very real difficulties they were encountering on the ground. This must have been incredibly frustrating for commanders like Massena who were facing these harsh realities.
It really highlights the inherent limitations of long-distance command, particularly in the context of a complex and rapidly evolving situation like the Peninsular War. Napoleon's directives, which were often conceived weeks earlier in Paris, frequently failed to accurately reflect the current circumstances and the specific challenges that his forces were facing in the Iberian Peninsula.
In an attempt to alleviate the pressure on Massena, Napoleon then ordered Marshal Soult, who is based in Andalusia in southern Spain, to launch a significant offensive. The aim was to draw Allied forces away from Lisbon, thereby hopefully enabling Massena to finally take the city. Soult's response to this directive was to initiate a siege of Badajoz, a strategically vital fortified city that controlled the southern route into Portugal.
Napoleon's strategic thinking here was aimed at forcing Wellington to detach a significant portion of his forces from the defense of Lisbon in order to protect the strategically important fortress of Badajoz. Soult's focus on capturing this key city was a direct consequence of Napoleon's overall strategy to relieve the pressure on Massena.
The events that followed saw Soult decisively defeat a 12,000-strong Spanish army of Extremadura that had been dispatched to relieve Badajoz.
Right.
This was followed by the city's eventual surrender to the French, resulting in the capture of a significant number of prisoners and valuable supplies for Soult's forces.
Right.
This is described as yet another major setback for the already struggling Spanish forces.
The continued and rather consistent defeats of the Spanish regular armies were a persistent and significant problem for the overall Allied war effort.
Right.
Despite the undeniable spirit of resistance among many Spanish soldiers, their frequent lack of effective leadership, adequate training, and sufficient equipment often led to these kinds of devastating losses on the battlefield.
However, despite the string of setbacks, there's a rather surprising remark about the continued willingness of many Spanish troops to fight on, even in the face of these repeated disasters and often ineffective leadership. It really speaks volumes about their deep commitment to the cause of resisting French occupation.
It does indeed.
Yeah.
Despite enduring repeated military defeats and suffering heavy casualties, the spirit of resistance and the determination to fight against French occupation remained remarkably unbroken among many Spanish soldiers. This unwavering popular will to continue the struggle was a crucial factor in sustaining the war effort, even when their more conventional military forces were struggling significantly.
Meanwhile, further to the west, Victor's Eque Corps, which was still engaged in the lengthy siege of Cadiz, found itself weakened as troops were needed to support other French operations in the region. This presented an opportunity for the Anglo-Spanish garrison within Cadiz to launch a counterattack. The Allies executed a landing along the coast with the aim of striking the French siege lines from the rear, leading to the Battle of Barossa.
The Battle of Barossa was a significant, although somewhat confused and chaotic engagement. The Allied landing caught the French forces off guard, but they reacted swiftly, leading to a fierce and costly battle fought along the coast.
The fighting at Barossa was intense, and our understanding is that the Anglo-Portuguese rearguard suffered considerable losses, but ultimately succeeded in repelling the French attack. However, there's also mention of a furious argument that erupted between the British commander, Sir Thomas Graham, and his Spanish counterpart, General La Peña, which unfortunately negated any potential strategic gains that might have come from the tactical victory. This sounds like a recurring and frustrating theme.
Sadly, yes, you're quite right.
Yeah.
The underlying distrust and often differing objectives between the British and Spanish high commands frequently hampered their ability to fully capitalize on tactical successes achieved on